Imagine you are standing on the deck of a $2 billion warship, the most advanced literal combat vessel the United States Navy has ever built, cutting through the Pacific Ocean with the pride of the entire American naval fleet behind you. The crew is trained, the mission is clear, and the technology surrounding you represents the absolute pinnacle of modern maritime engineering. And then, without warning, without enemy fire, without any act of war or hostility from any foreign power on Earth, the ship stops. Not gradually, not with warning. The engines choke, the systems groan, and one of the most expensive and controversial warships in American naval history sits dead in the water, crippled by a failure that the Navy would spend months trying to explain to Congress, to the public, and to itself. This is the story of the USS Manchester, a ship that became the symbol of everything that went wrong with America's most ambitious and most troubled warship program, and the engineering casualty of 2020 that forced the entire United States Navy to confront a question it had been avoiding for years. Was the literal combat ship program a revolutionary leap forward, or the most expensive mistake in modern naval procurement history? Welcome. You have chosen to spend your time with one of the most fascinating and underreported stories in recent American military history. This is not just a story about a ship breaking down. This is a story about ambition, about institutional failure, about the gap between what politicians promise and what engineers can deliver, about the men and women who serve aboard vessels they were told were the future of naval warfare, and about what happens when a superpower's military-industrial complex prioritizes budget spreadsheets over battle readiness. Before we are done today, you will understand not just what happened to the USS Manchester in 2020, but why it happened, why it was almost inevitable, and why the lessons from that engineering casualty should matter to every single person who cares about national security, military history, and the extraordinary complexity of keeping a modern Navy operational in the 21st century. Let us begin at the very beginning, because to understand the USS Manchester, you must first understand the world that created her. The year is 1991. The Cold War has just ended. The Soviet Union, that massive adversarial superpower that had driven American military spending and military doctrine for nearly 5 decades, is dissolving before the eyes of the world. For the United States Navy, this moment was both a triumph and a crisis. A triumph because the strategy of naval deterrence had worked. The Soviet fleet, despite its enormous size and ferocity, had never been able to challenge American naval supremacy where it truly counted. But a crisis because the entire justification for maintaining a 600-ship Navy, with its massive carrier battle groups and its blue water dominance doctrine, had just evaporated almost overnight. The Navy found itself in the 1990s with a simple but deeply uncomfortable problem. It had been built to fight the Soviets on the open ocean. But the threats of the post-Cold War world were not materializing on the open ocean. They were materializing in harbors, in rivers, in shallow coastal waters called the littoral zone, in the straits and channels and confined waterways where small, fast, asymmetric threats could emerge from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The 1987 attack on the USS Stark by an Iraqi aircraft firing Exocet missiles. The 1988 mining incident involving the USS Samuel B. Roberts in the Persian Gulf. The catastrophic attack on the USS Cole in Aden Harbor in the year 2000. These were the lessons the Navy was absorbing. The threat was not a Soviet carrier group appearing over the horizon. The threat was a small boat loaded with explosives, a sea mine drifting in shallow water, a diesel submarine lurking in the mud of a coastal shelf where American sonar could barely reach. So the Navy did what the American military-industrial complex always does when confronted with a new threat environment. It asked for a new platform, not a modified version of an existing ship, not an upgrade program, something entirely new, something revolutionary, something that had never been built before. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the concept that emerged from countless meetings in the Pentagon and in the offices of defense contractors across the country was the literal combat ship, which we will refer to from this point forward simply as the LCS. The vision for the LCS was genuinely exciting, and you have to give credit to the people who conceived it, because on paper, the concept was brilliant. The Navy did not want a traditional warship with fixed weapon systems and a dedicated mission profile. They wanted a modular warship, a ship that could be reconfigured rapidly for different missions. You needed to hunt submarines? Swap in the anti-submarine warfare mission package. You needed to sweep mines? Swap in the mine countermeasures package. You needed to deal with swarms of small fast attack boats? Swap in the surface warfare package. One hull, multiple missions, maximum flexibility. The ship would be fast, able to reach speeds of over 40 knots, which is genuinely extraordinary for a naval combatant of its size. It would have a small crew, made possible by extensive automation, which would reduce operating costs dramatically compared to traditional frigates and destroyers. And it would be built not by one contractor, but by two, in a competition that would ultimately produce two completely different ship designs, with the Navy selecting the better one after trials. This is where the story begins to get complicated, because the competition between the two designs, which were eventually built by Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics, produced not a winner and a loser, but two winners. In a decision that stunned many defense analysts and naval observers, the Navy chose to purchase both designs simultaneously, splitting procurement between the Freedom class, built by Lockheed Martin in Marinette, Wisconsin, and the Independence class, built by General Dynamics at Austell, USA, in Mobile, Alabama. The Freedom class was a semi-planing monohull design, looking broadly like a conventional warship, but sleeker and faster. The Independence class was a trimaran, 3 hulls joined together, looking like something from a science fiction film, with an enormous flight deck and a mission bay that could swallow vehicles, boats, and equipment. Having two entirely different ship classes with different propulsion systems, different crews, different maintenance requirements, and different spare parts inventories, sharing the same mission packages and the same operational doctrine was an engineering and logistical challenge of almost incomprehensible complexity. But in the optimism of the early 2000s, with defense budgets still riding the wave of post-September 11th spending increases, this seemed manageable. The LCS program was authorized, contracts were signed, and the Navy began the long, expensive, and ultimately troubled process of building the fleet of the future. The USS Manchester is hull number LCS-14. She is an Independence-class trimaran, built at Austell, USA in Mobile, Alabama. Her keel was laid down in June of 2014. She was launched in May of 2016. She was commissioned into the United States Navy on May 26, 2018, in a ceremony in Manchester, New Hampshire, the city whose name she bears. She is 419 feet long. She displaces approximately 3,100 tons at full load. She is powered by 2 gas turbines and 2 diesel engines driving 4 water jets, a propulsion system designed to push her to speeds in excess of 40 knots when everything is working correctly. Her home port was Naval Station San Diego, California. And from the moment of her commissioning, like every LCS before her, she began accumulating a record of engineering problems and operational challenges that would culminate in the casualty of 2020. To understand what happened in 2020, you need to understand the broader context of LCS propulsion problems, because the Manchester did not fail in isolation. She failed as part of a pattern so consistent and so well documented that when her own engineering casualty occurred, the reaction in naval circles was not shock. It was exhaustion. The LCS program had been struggling with propulsion reliability from almost the very beginning of fleet operations. The combination of high-power gas turbines, diesel engines, and complex water jet propulsion systems, all integrated into a hull designed for extreme speed, created maintenance challenges that the Navy had dramatically underestimated during the design and procurement phase. The gas turbines at the heart of the LCS propulsion system are derived from commercial aviation technology. The LM2500 gas turbine, used in some LCS variants, is essentially a marinized version of the same basic engine technology that powers commercial jetliners. This is not unusual in naval engineering. Many navies use marinized aircraft turbines. But the operating environment of a ship, with its salt air, its humidity, its vibration, and its demand for sustained high-power operation over thousands of hours, is far more demanding than the environment those engines were originally designed for. And the maintenance requirements for gas turbines are intensive. They demand precision. They demand trained technicians. They demand the right spare parts at the right time. And in the LCS program, all three of those requirements proved difficult to meet consistently. The Freedom-class ships had their own particular engineering challenges, involving a combining gear system that connected their multiple propulsion elements. Multiple Freedom-class ships suffered serious damage to these combining gears, leading to extended periods out of service for major repairs. The Independence-class ships, including the Manchester, had different but equally serious challenges involving their propulsion and mechanical systems. What emerged from years of operational experience was a picture of a ship class that, despite its revolutionary design and impressive specifications on paper, was significantly harder to keep operational than the frigates and destroyers it was supposed to complement and eventually replace. Now let us talk specifically about the 2020 engineering casualty of the USS Manchester. The year 2020 was, of course, an extraordinary year for the entire world. The COVID-19 pandemic was reshaping every aspect of human activity, including military operations. Naval forces around the world were grappling with the extraordinary challenge of keeping crews healthy and operational while maintaining their deployment schedules and their readiness postures. The United States Navy was dealing with multiple pandemic-related crises simultaneously, the most dramatic of which was the outbreak aboard the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt, which had forced the ship to offload its entire crew to Guam for quarantine in March and April of 2020. Against this chaotic backdrop, the USS Manchester's engineering casualty unfolded. The specific nature of the propulsion casualty that affected the Manchester in 2020 involved her water jet propulsion system. The water jet propulsion used on the Independence-class LCS ships is a particularly complex system. Unlike a conventional propeller-driven ship, where the propulsion mechanism is relatively straightforward to understand and maintain, a water jet system works by drawing water into the ship, accelerating it through a pump driven by the propulsion engines, and then ejecting it at high velocity to provide thrust. This gives the ship its extraordinary speed and maneuverability, particularly in shallow water where conventional propellers might be vulnerable to damage or cavitation. But it also creates a maintenance challenge of significant complexity, because the water jet systems are integrated deeply into the hull and are difficult to access for maintenance and repair without specialized facilities. The Manchester's propulsion casualty left the ship with degraded propulsion capability, meaning that her operational speed and maneuverability were significantly compromised. In naval terminology, a propulsion casualty of this kind places a warship in an extremely vulnerable position. A ship that cannot move at full speed cannot evade threats, cannot reposition quickly in response to a developing tactical situation, and cannot execute the kind of high-speed littoral operations that the LCS was specifically designed to perform. The USS Manchester, designed to race into contested shallow waters at over 40 knots, was reduced to a fraction of her design capability. The Navy's response to the Manchester's engineering casualty followed the standard pattern that had become depressingly familiar throughout the LCS program. The ship required maintenance that could not be performed at sea or at a forward operating location. She had to transit back to a facility with the specialized equipment and personnel needed to address the propulsion system problem. This transit itself required careful planning, because a ship with degraded propulsion is at increased risk during any ocean passage, particularly in challenging sea states. The logistics of getting the right spare parts, the right technical representatives from the contractor, and the right Navy maintenance personnel all organized and in the same place at the same time added further complexity and delay to the repair process. The 2020 casualty of the USS Manchester was not the first serious engineering problem the ship had experienced, and it would not be the last. But it occurred at a moment when the LCS program was already under intense scrutiny from Congress, from the Navy's own leadership, and from defense analysts and commentators who had been raising concerns about the program's readiness rates and operational availability for years. The timing amplified the significance of the casualty and contributed to an accelerating reassessment of the entire LCS program that would ultimately lead to some of the most dramatic procurement decisions in recent Navy history. To fully appreciate the significance of what happened to the Manchester, you need to understand the concept of operational availability, which is the percentage of time that a warship is actually available for missions rather than undergoing maintenance or repairs. For a naval combatant, operational availability is one of the most critical metrics of effectiveness. A ship that is in the shipyard is a ship that cannot defend a carrier strike group. A ship that is waiting for spare parts is a ship that cannot respond to a crisis. A ship with a degraded propulsion system is a ship that cannot execute its design mission. And throughout the LCS program, operational availability rates had been a persistent source of concern. The Navy's own assessments of LCS operational availability, as documented in multiple Government Accountability Office reports and in congressional testimony, told a story that was difficult to spin positively. LCS ships were spending significantly more time in maintenance and repair than the program's original projections had anticipated. The revolutionary modular mission package concept, which had been one of the program's most exciting selling points, was proving far harder to execute in practice than it had appeared in the design studies and computer models. Switching mission packages required trained personnel, specialized equipment, and carefully planned logistics that were often difficult to arrange in forward-deployed environments. In many cases, LCS ships deployed with a single mission package installed and never actually swapped packages during an entire deployment, which rather undermined the central justification for the program's complexity and cost. The crew reduction strategy, which was another major selling point of the LCS concept, was also proving problematic. The Independence-class ships were designed to operate with a core crew of around 40 personnel, supplemented by mission package crews and aviation detachments as needed. This was a dramatic reduction from the crew sizes of the frigates the LCS was designed to replace, which typically had crews of around 200 personnel. The reduction was made possible by extensive automation of ship systems, reducing the number of people needed to operate the vessel. But automation creates its own vulnerabilities. When automated systems fail, you need technicians who understand them deeply enough to diagnose and repair the problem. And with a crew of 40, the range of technical expertise available on the ship at any given moment is inherently limited. Complex propulsion casualty? You may not have the right specialist on board. Automated system failure at 2 in the morning in the middle of a transit? Your troubleshooting options are constrained by your crew size. The maintenance model that the Navy had designed for the LCS was also contributing to the readiness challenges that culminated in casualties like the ones suffered by the Manchester. Traditional naval surface combatants are maintained through a combination of crew-performed maintenance and periodic depot-level maintenance at naval shipyards and private shipyards under contract. The LCS program incorporated a greater reliance on contractor-provided maintenance, with manufacturer technical representatives and contractor maintenance teams performing work that on a traditional warship would have been done by the ship's crew. This model was intended to reduce the expertise burden on the small LCS crews. But it created dependencies that were difficult to manage in forward-deployed environments, where getting contractor teams to the ship's location could take days or weeks, extending any maintenance period significantly. Now let us think about the human dimension of all of this, because behind every engineering casualty, behind every readiness statistic, behind every GAO report and congressional hearing, there are sailors. There are men and women who put on their uniforms every morning and go to work on ships that they have been told are the future of American naval power. The crew of the USS Manchester during the 2020 period were professionals doing their jobs under difficult circumstances. They were dealing not just with the engineering challenges of their ship, but with the extraordinary stress of operating during a global pandemic, when normal personnel rotations were disrupted, when family communications were complicated, when the entire support structure that naval personnel depend on was strained to its limits. The engineers and technicians aboard the Manchester were dealing with a propulsion system of genuine complexity, trying to maintain equipment that, in some cases, was pushing the boundaries of what marine engineering had achieved before. These were not people who had failed. These were people operating in a system that had set them up for difficulties through decisions made years before they ever stepped aboard. The program managers who made decisions about automation and crew size. The procurement officials who prioritized cost reduction over reliability margins. The admirals who approved a maintenance model that placed extraordinary demands on small crews. The defense contractors who promised capabilities that proved difficult to deliver consistently in the operational environment. All of these factors combined to create the conditions that produced the Manchester's 2020 engineering casualty. Let us talk about the congressional response to the LCS program's reliability problems, because this is where the story connects to the broader questions of defense procurement, institutional accountability, and the way that American military power is developed and sustained in the 21st century. Congress had been expressing concern about the LCS program for years before the Manchester's 2020 casualty. The program had been through multiple reviews, multiple restructurings, and multiple reductions in the originally planned by quantity. What had started as a program intended to produce 55 ships had been scaled back dramatically as the cost per ship increased and the capability concerns mounted. The Armed Services Committees of both the House and Senate had been receiving testimony about LCS readiness for years. Government Accountability Office reports had documented the operational availability challenges in careful detail. Think tanks and defense analysts had published extensive analyses questioning whether the LCS was delivering the capability that had been promised when the program began. But changing direction on a major defense program is extraordinarily difficult, for reasons that go beyond simple inertia. The LCS program supported thousands of jobs in Marinette, Wisconsin, and Mobile, Alabama. The contractors had powerful lobbying operations and deep relationships with congressional delegations from those states. The Navy had institutional interests in defending a program that its own leadership had championed. And the sunk cost of billions of dollars already spent created powerful psychological and political pressures to continue rather than admit failure and stop. The 2020 casualty of the USS Manchester, coming in the middle of a pandemic year when every aspect of defense readiness was under scrutiny, added another data point to an already damning record. It contributed to a reassessment that was already underway in the Navy's leadership, driven in part by new leadership perspectives and in part by the accumulating evidence that the LCS, as originally conceived, was not delivering on its core promises of flexibility, readiness, and affordability. In July of 2020, just months after the Manchester's engineering problems became public, the Navy announced a stunning decision. The service would not request funding for additional LCS ships, in the upcoming budget cycle. Instead, it would begin transitioning to a new class of ship, the Constellation-class frigate, which represented a return to more conventional naval ship design principles after the revolutionary and troubled LCS experiment. The Constellation-class frigate is based on a proven European design, the Frem frigate used by the French and Italian navies, heavily modified to meet U.S. Navy requirements. It is a larger, heavier, more capable ship than the LCS, with more powerful weapons systems, more survivability features, and a design philosophy that prioritizes reliability and fighting power over the revolutionary modularity and extreme speed of the LCS. This decision was not directly caused by the Manchester's 2020 casualty alone. It was the product of years of accumulating evidence that the LCS concept, however innovative and however well-intentioned, had not delivered on its promises in the operational environment. But the Manchester's casualty and the publicity it generated contributed to the political environment in which that decision became possible. It was one more piece of evidence that the Navy's own leadership, the people who had to make the hard choices about future procurement, could not ignore. Let us now go deeper into the technical specifics of what the LCS engineering challenges tell us about the limits of innovation in complex military systems. Because there is a profound lesson here that extends far beyond the LCS program and speaks to fundamental truths about how technology behaves in the real world versus how it behaves in design studies and computer simulations. The LCS program made a series of design choices that were individually rational but collectively created a system of extraordinary fragility. The choice of water jets over conventional propellers was rational. Water jets are faster and more maneuverable in shallow water, but they are also more complex to maintain and harder to repair in the field. The choice of gas turbines as primary propulsion was rational. Gas turbines deliver extraordinary power-to-weight ratios, but they are maintenance-intensive and sensitive to the corrosive marine environment. The choice of small crews was rational. Smaller crews cost less money and reduce the logistical footprint. But small crews have limited redundancy and limited onboard technical expertise for dealing with complex casualties. The choice of contractor-provided maintenance was rational. Contractors have specialized expertise that small crews cannot replicate. But contractor support requires supply chains and logistics that are difficult to maintain in forward-deployed environments. Each of these choices, taken individually, was defensible. Taken together, they created a ship that was highly optimized for ideal conditions and highly vulnerable to the inevitable challenges of real-world operations. This is a problem that engineers call brittleness. A system is brittle when it performs extremely well within its design parameters, but degrades rapidly when those parameters are exceeded. The LCS, with its extraordinary speed and flexibility when everything is working correctly, was a brittle system. And in the demanding, unpredictable, maintenance-challenging environment of sustained naval operations, brittle systems fail. There is another concept from engineering and organizational theory that is deeply relevant here, and that is the concept of normal accidents, a theory developed by sociologist Charles Perrow in his study of complex technological systems. Perrow argued that in sufficiently complex systems, with enough interactive components and enough tight coupling between those components, accidents are not aberrations. They are normal. They are the expected consequence of complexity itself. The LCS propulsion system, with its gas turbines, its diesel engines, its water jets, its complex control systems, and all the interfaces and interactions between these components, is precisely the kind of tightly coupled, highly interactive system that Perrow's theory predicts will experience cascading failures. The Manchester's 2020 propulsion casualty was not a surprise from this perspective. It was the system behaving exactly as complex systems behave. The Navy's response to the LCS program's engineering challenges over the years also illustrates an important truth about large institutions confronting uncomfortable realities. Organizations are extraordinarily good at generating explanations for why the current problems are manageable, why the next generation of training or maintenance procedures will solve the issues, why the program just needs a little more time and a little more money to achieve its potential. This is not malice. It is human psychology operating within institutional structures. The people defending the LCS program in congressional hearings and internal reviews genuinely believed, in most cases, that the problems were solvable. The tragedy is not that they were dishonest. The tragedy is that they were wrong, and that the process of discovering they were wrong cost the Navy and the American taxpayer enormous amounts of money and operational capability that could have been directed elsewhere. Let us also examine the geopolitical context of the LCS program's reliability problems, because a warship that is in the maintenance facility is not just an expensive piece of metal sitting idle. It is a gap in the national security posture of the United States at a moment when that posture is being challenged by adversaries who are watching very carefully. China's naval expansion throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s has been one of the most dramatic military buildups in modern history. The People's Liberation Army Navy has been commissioning new ships at a rate that has drawn alarm from American defense planners and their allies in the Pacific. And while China has been building, the United States has been grappling with readiness challenges across its naval fleet, of which the LCS program's reliability problems are one of the most visible examples. The littoral combat environment, the shallow coastal waters where the LCS was designed to operate, is particularly critical in the Pacific context. The island chains of the Western Pacific, the contested waters of the South China Sea, the straits and channels through which enormous volumes of global commerce flow, are precisely the kind of littoral environment where an LCS, if it worked as designed, would provide a critical operational capability. A fast, agile, mine-clearing, submarine hunting, surface threat neutralizing littoral combatant would be enormously valuable in any military confrontation in the Pacific theater. The fact that the LCS program struggled to consistently deliver that capability, that ships like the Manchester were experiencing engineering casualties rather than operational deployments, was not just an embarrassment for the Navy. It was a strategic problem of genuine significance. This is why the story of the USS Manchester and the LCS program matters not just as a piece of military history, not just as a cautionary tale about procurement and program management, but as a lesson in how the decisions made by governments, corporations, and military institutions in peacetime shape the capabilities and vulnerabilities of a nation when it actually needs to use military power. The decisions made in the late 1990s and early 2000s about how to design and build the LCS were producing their consequences 20 years later, not just in the engineering casualty of the Manchester, but in a fleet whose readiness rates and operational capabilities fell short of what American national security required. The story of the LCS also invites a comparison with how other navies have approached the challenge of littoral operations, and this comparison is both instructive and humbling. Several Allied navies, facing similar operational challenges in the littoral environment, made different choices and achieved different results. The Danish Navy's Standflex modular concept, which influenced LCS design thinking in important ways, achieved genuine modularity with smaller vessels that were more reliable and more maintainable than the LCS. The Swedish Visby-class corvette achieved impressive stealth and littoral capability in a smaller, simpler package. Germany's Miko family of modular frigates demonstrated that modular design could be implemented in a way that was maintainable and reliable across decades of service life. These international comparisons suggest that the failures of the LCS program were not inevitable consequences of attempting modular, littoral warfare ship design. They were the specific consequences of the particular design choices, procurement decisions, and institutional management approaches that the United States Navy and its contractors made. The decision to build two competing designs simultaneously, dividing resources and creating dual logistics chains, was a political decision, not an engineering decision. The decision to pursue extreme crew reduction beyond what was technically prudent was a budget decision, not an operational decision. The decision to accept delivery of ships whose mission packages were not yet mature was a schedule decision, not a capability decision. Each of these decisions was made by specific people in specific institutional roles responding to specific pressures, and each of them contributed in measurable ways to the conditions that produced the Manchester's 2020 engineering casualty and the broader readiness challenges of the LCS fleet. As we move toward the resolution of this story, let us reflect on what happened after the 2020 casualty and the decisions that the Navy made about the future of the LCS program. The transition to the Constellation-class frigate represents a genuine reckoning with the lessons of the LCS experience. The Constellation class is designed with reliability as a primary requirement, not an afterthought. Its crew size is larger than the LCS, reflecting a recognition that automation can supplement but cannot replace human expertise and redundancy in a warship's crew. Its propulsion system is based on proven technology with a longer service record in demanding marine environments. Its weapons systems are more capable and more mature than the mission packages of the LCS. And crucially, it is based on a design that has already been built and operated by allied navies, reducing the risk of discovering fundamental design flaws only after the ships are in commission. But the LCS ships that have already been built, including the USS Manchester, are not going away. The Navy has committed to keeping them in service through the mid-2030s, continuing to operate them and maintain them and find missions for them that play to their strengths while managing their weaknesses. The Manchester herself continues to serve in the United States Navy, a vessel whose engineering challenges are part of the historical record of the LCS program, but whose crew continues to perform their duties with professionalism and dedication regardless of the institutional debates swirling around their ship class. There is something worth saying here about the sailors themselves, because in all of the analysis of program management and procurement decisions and GAO reports and congressional hearings, it is easy to lose sight of the human beings who serve on these ships. The crew of the USS Manchester and the crews of every LCS are not the people who made the decisions that produced the program's challenges. They are the people who deal with the consequences of those decisions every day. They maintain complex systems with limited crew and limited tools. They deploy far from home in ships that the defense press regularly describes in unflattering terms. They do their jobs with the professionalism that the United States Navy demands and that the American public should honor, regardless of the institutional debates about the platforms they serve on. The 2020 engineering casualty of the USS Manchester was, in one sense, a failure. A multi-billion-dollar warship was unable to perform its design mission because of a propulsion system breakdown. That is a failure, but in another sense, it was a revelation. It revealed, with clarity that could not be dismissed or explained away, the extent to which the LCS program had fallen short of its potential. And revelations, even painful ones, can be the beginning of correction. The Navy's decision to transition to the Constellation-class frigate was made by people who looked at the evidence that casualties like the Manchesters represented and chose to chart a different course. That is how institutions learn, slowly, painfully, and at great expense, but they do learn. The lessons of the LCS program, crystallized in events like the Manchester's 2020 engineering casualty, are already being applied to the design and procurement of the Constellation class. Requirements are being set with a greater emphasis on demonstrated, proven capability rather than projected, theoretical capability. Crew sizes are being set to provide genuine operational and maintenance flexibility rather than minimum cost staffing. Propulsion systems are being selected for their reliability record in demanding environments, not just their performance on the specification sheet. These are not revolutionary insights. They are lessons that naval engineers and ship designers have known for generations. But they are lessons that the LCS program, in its ambition and its revolutionary aspirations, temporarily forgot. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves extended attention, and that is the role of the defense industrial base in shaping military capability. The LCS program was not just a Navy program. It was a partnership between the Navy and two of the most powerful defense contractors in the United States, Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics, through Austal USA. These companies brought genuine engineering talent, genuine innovation, and genuine commitment to the program. They also brought institutional interests in maximizing contract value, in winning competitions, and in defending their designs against criticism. The relationship between the government and its defense contractors is one of the most complex and consequential relationships in American public life, and the LCS program is a case study in both the possibilities and the pitfalls of that relationship. When a defense contractor makes optimistic projections about what a new design will achieve, those projections are not necessarily dishonest. Engineers are optimists by nature, and the computer models and simulations used to predict ship performance are sophisticated but imperfect. But when those optimistic projections become contractual commitments, and when the consequences of failing to meet those commitments fall not on the contractor's profit margin, but on the operational capability of the Navy, there is a structural problem in the incentive system that needs to be addressed. The LCS program had this problem, and the Manchester's 2020 casualty was one of its symptoms. Defense acquisition reform has been a subject of discussion in Washington for decades. Every administration of both parties has promised to make the defense procurement process faster, cheaper, and more effective. Some reforms have achieved partial success. Many have foundered on the complexity of the system and the power of the interests that benefit from the existing arrangements. The LCS program will inevitably be a case study in future discussions about acquisition reform because it illustrates so clearly what can go wrong when ambitious technical requirements, optimistic cost projections, political pressures, and complex contractor relationships all interact in ways that produce expensive disappointment rather than genuine operational capability. As we draw toward the conclusion of this journey through one of the most fascinating and consequential stories in recent American naval history, let us take a moment to appreciate the full scale of what the LCS program represents. The Navy has spent over $30 billion on the LCS program. It has built more than 30 ships of two entirely different designs. It has developed multiple mission packages, some of which are still not fully mature after nearly 2 decades of development. It has trained thousands of sailors on platforms that required new skills and new approaches to naval operations. And it has learned, through the hard and expensive school of operational experience, lessons about the limits of revolutionary design philosophy in military systems that are meant to operate reliably in hostile environments. The USS Manchester's 2020 engineering casualty is, in the perspective of this larger story, a single chapter in a much longer narrative. But it is an important chapter because it occurred at a moment when the accumulating evidence of the LCS program's challenges could no longer be absorbed and explained away. It was a catalyst that contributed to a reassessment that was already overdue. And it stands as a reminder, one that will serve American defense planners well as they develop the next generation of naval combatants, that the gap between a promising concept and a reliable weapon system is measured not in drawings and specifications, but in the years of operational experience, maintenance challenges, engineering casualties, and institutional learning that turn a revolutionary idea into something that actually works when a nation needs it most. The men and women who serve in the United States Navy, on the Manchester, and on every other vessel in the fleet, deserve ships that work. They deserve platforms whose revolutionary ambitions have been tempered by the wisdom of experience and the humility of genuine engineering rigor. The story of the LCS and of the Manchester's 2020 casualty is ultimately a story about that obligation. The obligation of a nation to the people who put on its uniform. The obligation of institutions to the truth about what their decisions actually deliver. And the obligation of everyone who cares about military history and national security to understand, clearly and without illusion, the difference between the weapons we aspire to build and the weapons we actually need. This has been the story of the USS Manchester and the engineering casualty that became a turning point. A story of ambition and failure, of innovation and brittleness, of institutional learning and the extraordinary cost of the lessons that complex systems teach us about ourselves. It is a story that is still being written on the decks of LCS ships that continue to sail, in the shipyards where Constellation-class frigates are taking shape, and in the minds of the naval officers and defense planners who are trying to ensure that the lessons of the Manchester are not forgotten when the next revolutionary ship design emerges from the drawing boards and the computer models and the optimistic projections of the next generation of naval architects. Thank you for being here for this story. Thank you for caring about the history, the human beings, and the institutions that shape the military power on which so much depends. This is the kind of history that does not make headlines every day, but it is the kind of history that shapes the world that everyone lives in, one engineering decision, one procurement contract, one engineering casualty at a time.